But I remember reviewing David Cronenberg's Crash. That was the first film I got to review in a student paper, which was very delayed in its release over here because of the censorship row. The BBFC eventually passed it, and it was shown at Oxford at the Ultimate Picture Palace. And I remember going along and reviewing that. And then I started doing a bunch of reviews after that. And I'd always been interested in film and keen to write about film, but this seemed like a really good outlet for doing it. And I sort of worked my way up and eventually ended up editing the arts section and then editing the paper for one term. So alongside my degree, I was getting this kind of hands-on journalistic experience. And that translated quite quickly after graduating. I was very lucky and landed the job on the Telegraph that I still have, which is basically as their sort of deputy film critic. I write almost entirely from home. I live in King's Cross and just have a home office in my flat. So I spend sort of half the week out and about at screenings and this and that, and then the other half of the week home getting the reviews done. I have a kind of weekly deadline. Thursday mornings usually is when all the reviews need to be in by. So that gives me a day or two earlier in the week to kind of cobble them all together. I occasionally go into the Telegraph office, but not very often. I would say the point of film criticism is to sort of enhance appreciation of cinema and bring films to people's attention, to bring the reasons that films are important to people's attention. And this is historical, this is going back into film history, but it's also week to week, promoting and kind of apostrophizing new work that audiences might want to see, and explaining why these films are of value or not of value, and doing a job of arguing that point either way. And I think it's also entertainment in itself. I think film criticism is fun, and it should be fun to read, and it should be an art form in its own right. And some of the very best film critics will be read. Someone like Pauline Kael will be read on films that people have ceased to bother watching, but just because her writing holds up and is in itself really enjoyable. Yeah, when I sit down at the blank page, I haven't necessarily decided what the whole flow of the review is going to be or the article is going to be. It kind of comes out, the inspiration for it comes out as you're sitting there, really, and sometimes you won't quite have realised why a film has worked on you the way it has until you're sort of halfway through a paragraph, and suddenly you'll realise, oh, that's it, that's what it is, and the words will come out and it will kind of make sense to you. So I suppose I like the process of discovery that the writing allows. Scribbling little ideas, and kind of you reread them and they kind of remind you of your overall experience of the film, and they're good prompts. They're good prompts for thought, but they don't actually necessarily end up making it into the finished review. What will sometimes happen is I'll see the film at a festival, say, and perhaps we won't decide to review it there and then if it's not a massive deal. And then a few months later, when it opens in the UK, I'll see it again. I'll need to see it again because it will have been so long, and that's actually a nice situation to be in. Or you will review a film at a festival, and then you'll have the chance to kind of reconsider that review a few months down the line. You'll go back to it, and sometimes you won't want to change it necessarily, but sometimes there'll be little things you want to emphasize more or whatever. And I also really like revisiting a film after I've reviewed it, and giving it a few months again and kind of going back to it and seeing if I still agree with what I thought. And there's a certain sort of snobbery towards the idea that film reviewing is not really worth considering in the same category as film criticism. It's often a question of word counts and how much space you have to express yourself. But I think so. I wouldn't say that a film critic had to have reams of space to work in, and that a kind of tabloid film reviewer is not a critic. I think that's kind of a snobby distinction. But you can sort of see that there is a bit of a continuum there. There's a bit of a spectrum, and really substantial film criticism, I think, requires a lot of context, requires a lot of experience and kind of knowledge of cinema. Whereas sort of you can get snappy judgments on a film from someone who's, for whom it is perhaps the first one they've ever seen. That would still count as a review, but it probably wouldn't count as kind of like criticism in the broader sense. I don't know where I would put myself on that spectrum. Probably somewhere in the middle. I mean, it just depends on what particular assignment I've been given. But yes, I definitely enjoy writing criticism at length when I get the chance. and having the scope to kind of really make a substantial argument about a filmmaker or a film. And it feels like you're sort of stretching intellectual muscles in a way when you do that you don't have the chance to stretch when you're just doing a 200-word kind of capsule review for the new superhero film or whatever it is. I like to respond to the film, if say we're talking about a film that we're seeing for the first time, I like to respond to it in quite a visceral way initially. I don't take that many notes. I perhaps scribble down a few lines of dialogue or a few little observations, but I'm more or less just trying to let the film work on me and kind of do its job. And then it's afterwards that I will start to analyse why it did or didn't elicit a response, or why it annoyed me or why it moved me or whatever it is. I'll figure out that. I'll figure out the kind of reason for the response afterwards. And in fact, I won't really figure it out until I'm sitting down writing about it sometimes. I find that my thoughts on a film don't necessarily come into focus until I'm actually sitting looking at the blank page and kind of writing it through. And I'll sort of realise, that's why that performance worked. As I'm kind of halfway through the sentence about it, it will suddenly make sense to me that there's no in that case there's sort of there's no really specific thought until you've articulated the thought, if you like. The words are very important in kind of bringing it into a clear focus. Most commonly, I'll kind of have a fairly clear idea when I emerge from the film, how much I liked it on the sort of relative scale of things. Sometimes I won't. Sometimes it will be something that I'll kind of sit with and make my mind up about later. And that's always quite interesting, actually, when you come out of a film and you're not quite sure yet if you liked it. You probably have some set of responses there already, but you're not quite sure which way they're tending. That's rare and kind of interesting. But I think perhaps in the age we're living in is so quick to rush to judgment on a film, and the publicity machines behind them are so kind of on the ball in terms of wanting to know straight away what you may have thought, that as a professional critic you're actually pushed into quite hasty judgment sometimes. You're certainly encouraged to feel quite firmly one way or the other as soon as you get out, and that perhaps maybe that unhelpfully accelerates our kind of evaluation. You come out and you're immediately thinking, or you're being forced to think in terms of star ratings or whatever it is. And I kind of wish that weren't the case sometimes, but I think it's the nature of the beast. And the focus now is much more on the review going online as soon as possible, being widely seen there across the world, in a way that when I began, they would put it online almost as an afterthought, that it went on the Telegraph website, but often not for a day or two. And finding it was difficult. The search engines weren't working so well. Back then, it was certainly much more important, that the review was there in print the next day, and top of the page or whatever, being seen by almost exclusively, Telegraph readers. So that has been a big change, and I think has sort of had knock-on effects on other things like the star ratings. I think now, because the review online can be disseminated so quickly everywhere, it becomes a more important tool. Star ratings become a more important kind of marketing tool to position that review, which again is something I have mixed feelings about, to be honest. But in terms of the writing, I guess I probably have more scope now to write longer pieces, just having been doing it for a while. There's more demand for the kind of articles that we do. I've started doing, in terms of my own work, I've started doing more interviews and more features than I used to, so it's not exclusively reviews. When I began, I was basically doing reviews. But we've also seen changes in the kind of landscape of British film criticism. There are fewer national critics now than there used to be. More papers have decided they can kind of dispense with the services of their critics, which has been sad to see. And that's again possibly because of the the democratization of film reviewing online. There are many more voices out there, and many people willing to kind of chip in and do it for free. So why would you pay someone to do it, professionally as a full-time vocation? And that's the question that a lot of publications are asking themselves. I'm lucky in that the paper I write for actually has put a lot of time and kind of money behind its film coverage and considers it quite important. And so we're kind of surviving. We've got our head above water, but it's worrying times for a lot of people in this business, I think. The Telegraph still has pretty substantial circulation, the highest one for a daily broadsheet, and you wouldn't want to kind of downplay the importance of the print review. And certainly if a major film is premiering or receiving its first press screening of an evening, they want to get a review in the paper the next morning. That still really matters. What also matters, perhaps more, is getting that same review online as quickly as possible. And the haste to get those reviews up becomes kind of all-consuming and quite demanding, really, because you have shorter and shorter periods of time to turn those reviews around from festivals and elsewhere. They really want them. They want it up first. Every paper wants the review up first because that drives traffic to the site best. And there's this phrase that Mark Kermode uses, "first but wrong," which I think everyone is fighting against. You don't want to be the one who has hastily rushed out a review, which you then kind of don't agree. You find yourself disagreeing with or recanting down the line. So having to be quite kind of speedy, but also accurate to your own response is a challenge these days, and one that we're all getting perhaps better at. The more experience you have at doing that, the better you can become at it. I mean, if they were trying to get it in the paper the next day, they would want it like as soon as. So sometimes 45 minutes is what you're looking at, and in festival situations, that's also the case. I mean, I'm comfortable with, say, an hour and a half to 2 hours as a time period to turn a review around. That's fine, but sometimes they will not give you that luxury. They really want it more quickly than that, and there are people sitting there on the arts desk waiting for it to come in and preparing the page online, putting all the furniture up and the picture and everything, just literally waiting to swing the copy in at the last minute. In a way, you're having to do several things at once while you're watching the film. You're responding to it, you're analysing the response, you're beginning to think of how you will explain it, you're beginning to think of what words you will use to explain it, and then you're perhaps writing more notes and kind of scribbling down whole sentences and paragraphs. If I'm really under the time pressure that a major premiere at a film festival creates, then I do find myself sometimes scribbling the outline of the review while I'm literally there which is not brilliant in terms of concentration and actually engaging with the film. It's quite hard to switch all those bits of your brain on at once and be in your kind of writing mode while you're also in your viewing mode. But it's that, again, is the nature of the beast. So I think that probably does mean that shortcuts are being taken, really. The luxury of having time to do all the writing afterwards and all the kind of rationalising after the experience of watching it, I think, is a thing of the past. Every major publication has kind of obviously realised that they can't live on their print coverage alone, and the Telegraph's big drive has been towards the internet in the last few years, and kind of all-consumingly so in terms of if you look at the appointments they've made and the people they've let go, it's almost always been in the direction of kind of the digital future. That's the sort of where we're heading, and they're trying to sort of outrun. I mean, everyone's trying to outrun their obsolescence in that way. I think print criticism is endangered for sure. And it's a difficult area because I think perhaps because as every paper and publication wants to survive, they're having to kind of make fairly hard choices about how they're monetizing, and advertising becomes extremely important, and this creates issues because of all aspects of a newspaper's coverage that might endanger advertising. Let's say in the arts pages, criticism is fairly high up. Film companies do not want to pay however much they're going to pay for a full page ad on the left-hand page and then receive a 1-star review on the right-hand page. That will create huge, eruptions, and sometimes critics get caught in the middle of that. And much as every paper wants to preserve a separation of church and state in that way between their kind of commercial wing and their editorial wing, that's always a conversation that's going on, and I feel as though that seems to be quite pronounced in print still. It's just because of that physical juxtaposition between the advert and the review, and that as a sort of a nightmare image for anyone who's promoting the film. Online, I feel as though there might be a little bit more independence still to kind of go off out on a limb and kind of write a long, bitter, impassioned argument against a film, which perhaps needn't even be a review. It could be a piece of writing that you just decide to make and kind of submit. And that might be an interesting future. In fact, the kind of long form criticism online that is not exactly a review, but something else. I'd like to think that perhaps we can expand beyond just the review format and move into kind of longer form pieces online. Have a real argument to make in favour of a film or against a film. And also, I really enjoy digging back into film history and kind of, bringing to people's attention the work of a filmmaker who has perhaps fallen out of fashion or whatever. That's not necessarily the stuff that's going to kind of earn the crust. I think it's the weekly round of kind of big new premieres and also major interviews and that kind of stuff that the paper always demands. That's sort of like the shop window, if you like. But I like the other stuff in the back of the shop. I like the kind of longer stuff that you can find online and that they will encourage you to do, which they're always looking for. I think there's scope for all of that, and that's stuff that I find is less pressurized. There's less haste to get it done quickly, and that means that you don't have to do such a kind of quick, sometimes perhaps sloppy job of rushing it out. You've got time to think about that stuff. So I think when we haven't reached the end of the line yet, basically, is what I would say. Even though it becomes sort of harder and harder to have a really independent mindset and kind of feel as though you're doing a good job of explaining yourself week in, week out when you're under those deadline pressures and those star rating pressures and those kind of commercial pressures and all of that. I still think there's a whole other world of film criticism out there that you can kind of still get into and link to. If the newspaper decided, well, this person's going to do it for free, should we have them? And they took the view that their opinion was equally interesting and well articulated, then of course they would go for the person that they're not paying. So the only person you have to prove your value to is your employer, really. Some people would say, what about the reader? Where does the reader factor in? And I think that you don't need to worry about that too much personally if your employer is doing that worrying for you, basically. It's an interesting question when you're thinking about the tastes of a readership and kind of who you're writing for, who you're writing towards, because you do run into kind of conflict and kind of disputes with readers who have kind of taken against a line of argument on a film or whatever. But yeah, they tend to be quite squabbly kind of scenarios that you don't necessarily want to get embroiled in too much. I mean, a lot of the stuff that goes on in the bottom half of the internet is just basically a massive bun fight, and that's not where really intelligent debate is to be had. I think I would like to hope that people find it a sort of stimulating or entertaining read. That's my kind of foremost objective in the writing. Really, is sort of like keep people's attention, and don't belabor it, and don't be too sort of stuffy or academic about it, but also don't be too kind of glib or jokey or flippant and feel as though you're just kind of putting on a sort of clown show. I'm not sure that's good either. You want to strike a balance. There needs to be kind of intelligent substance to the review, but also a kind of I guess a lightness of touch, and some attempt to kind of entertain the reader as well as explain your point of view. So I don't really like to read too much about a film until I've seen it myself. I think it's not great to do that because you end up sort of having an argument with the reviews you've already read, which isn't really of relevance to the person reading your review more often than not. but once I've seen the film, I'm very interested to know what other critics have made of it, and there are a lot of writers, especially in America, that I will turn to and kind of find extremely illuminating. And yeah, in terms of, I like the back and forth that you then get. In fact, during awards season, this is a good time of year for film criticism, because it's a time of year where the same films are coming up again and again. Everyone's weighing in on them, and then perhaps seeing them again, and then having another point of view. And you find a lot of kind of back and forth happening with those arguments and those articles. And someone will stake out a position, and then someone else will come at that and kind of question it, challenge it, and perhaps defend the film against those charges or whatever. And I find that very interesting, because you can keep going down that road and keep refining what the sort of what the various positions are on the film, and get deeper and deeper into the film's approach or the film's kind of content, and kind of thereby get a much bigger picture of what it's doing. You can sort of get some good back and forth going on Twitter, but I think the more substantial stuff is actually kind of long form pieces. There was a brilliant piece by Mark Harris about Selma and the critical reaction to Selma, because Selma was a film that basically the right wing in America kind of threw under a bus. They decided that it was very misleading in its characterization of LBJ, and those critics picked on a couple of instances where the screenwriting had taken some liberties, as if it's not imaginable or allowable for a filmmaker to take some liberties with the kind of biography they're dealing with. And they kind of used that to sort of take the film apart, really. And Mark Harris wrote a very, very good and balanced response to that, in which he kind of said there is this one thing that the filmmakers did which was perhaps didn't help them or gave ammo to their critics, but so many of the other liberties that it was taking were creative and artistic and valid interpretations of what had historically happened. And a filmmaker should really be encouraged to do that, rather than just find themselves constrained by the record and just producing essentially a documentary in sort of fiction form. It was great, and it kind of fed on a lot of the criticism that had already occurred around that film, but it incorporated it all and responded to it all really well. And that's a kind of great example of film criticism in practice, I think.